Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. So, this week on the podcast, I'm joined by Pete Mattock, author of Visible Maths, Conceptual Maths, and Leading Maths. How are you, Pete? Great to have you here.
Yeah, I'm all good, Kieran. Thank you very much for having me. Very happy to be here.
It's a union of the great beards of math education. I don't think there are any
Yours is far better than mine, although I think overall I have more hair on my head than you do.
mud. I was just admiring your hair, Pete. To be honest, that's all I know. But I wish, I wish, because mine
Well,
was
you've
roughly the
just
same.
concentrated it all down here. That's the thing. I've spread it out.
Yeah, my barber said I could fold it back over, but I wasn't very happy with that comment. He's not getting a tip next time.
Well, you see, this is what happens when you just stop going to the barber.
Yeah. So, Pete, we're going to focus our attention on conceptual understanding. But first, in case there's anyone who doesn't know who you are, how about if you give us a little bit about where you're from and how you got here today?
Yeah, sure. So I started teaching in 2006, so just shy of 20 years. Just standard. Did PGCE. Started teaching maths in secondary schools, which is obviously odd for a primary podcast, but yeah. Started teaching maths in secondary schools. Worked through head of department, and that most of that was down south in Oxfordshire. And then I moved back to Leicestershire, where I'm from, and got involved very much with the NCETM, was part of their first cohort of mastery specialists, stuff like that. Didn't get to go to Shanghai because it was my first year in a new school, unfortunately, and it was not the right time for me to be released to go to Shanghai. But yeah, sort of did that, and then got into representation. I'd already started getting into representation and structure in a very big way before the NCT, before I did the stuff with the NCTM. But that sort of broadened things, and that led to the first book. But what it really led to is me realizing, because for the first 10 years of my career, I hadn't really thought much about teaching maths, which was really, odd to say now, but I just taught, as many people, I just taught it the way I've been taught. Um, and it led to me thinking a lot more about how to teach maths education, what school level maths looks like. That led to the second book, and yeah, so uh, eventually, in fact, very recently, uh, actually left the classroom. Still adjusting to that, but now obviously working full time as a national education lead for maths for Twinkle, which is really, really exciting.
It does take some adjusting. I think the first year I was still behaving as if I was in the classroom. So it's a wild one, but it's good to see that you're enjoying that new challenge and that new role that you've got.
Yeah, definitely. Very much looking forward to seeing what I can make of it and using, a platform like that to try and improve maths ed on a national scale, which is what the role is about.
Our paths first crossed possibly at a maths conf.
Oh
If
yeah, probably at MathsCon several years ago.
if not, yeah, if not on social media, and I've always found you ask really really thoughtful questions in sessions and stuff like that. There, and so I've always been a big fan of your work and the thinking you do. You mentioned the secondary thing, but we've had lots of secondary teachers on, and particularly in maths. It's one big journey that depends so heavily on everything. I know you'll subscribe to the phase is sometimes unhelpful.
Yes,
So,
yeah, they keep. I've been noting recently with people keep saying talking about GCSE being 2 years, GCSE being 5 years. Like no, GCSE is 11, 12 years.
yeah,
From the minute you start schooling, and so, people rightly said even earlier than that, the preschool experiences of mathematics. You start to see differences even at that level when they start formal schooling. So, it's a journey for, one could argue, 16 years.
yeah, definitely, yeah, because with those experiences, your choice of manipulative, the whether or not different representations are going to work for pupils, they will depend on where they're coming from and what their preschool experiences were. So I'm totally with you. Because as those children who have those great experiences the whole way through, I think GCSE is almost like a not a breeze, but they take it in their stride, because they've had that really well-rounded experience of mathematics in general.
yes, and when they've found success in it, I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there that know about the sort of relationship between success and motivation and things like that. And when you've found success and praise and encouragement with a subject, I don't think it really matters what the subject is. You're going to find it easy to keep moving forward. Whereas whether it's due to teaching practice or whether it's due to a lack of background in your preschool years or whatever else, when you come to something and you struggle with it, unless somebody can turn it around for you, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And you get 16 years of accumulated bad experience.
And then you're not going to develop the kind of understanding, the conceptual understanding that we're going to focus on today. So I think it makes sense to start with definitions. What does conceptual understanding mean to you?
So I actually really liked Will's definition when I listened to it, because you had Will on a little while ago, and he shared that on the previous podcast. That sort of idea of deeper and comprehensive connected knowledge of those abstract ideas, which enables that novel thinking, problem solving, and learning. I think as a general definition, that's quite a good one. I think for maths in particular, I'd probably mention something about recognizing and exploiting structure. I think that's really important in mathematics. And, to develop a conceptual understanding of maths, you need to start to get into that deep structure and be able to recognize that and exploit that. And then obviously, we talked about my books already. In Conceptual Maths, I use the tagline learning about rather than just how to do maths in schools, because I think a lot of, certainly my experience and my history of maths education and my own experience as a student of maths, was a lot of learning to do stuff, and then there's this whole other side which is actually learning about mathematical ideas, which is because you'll have listeners out there that have heard about things like declarative and procedural and conditional knowledge. And it's not just that declarative knowledge, it goes further than that. You talk about the sum of the angles at a point on a straight line is 180 degrees. Well, that's declarative knowledge, but that's not conceptual understanding. Conceptual understanding means I know that. I know that the sum of the angles at a point on a straight line is 180 degrees, but I also know how that property arises from how a degree is defined. Yeah, the degree is defined in a certain way, and that property arises from it. And I also know how that knowledge influences further knowledge, like the fact that opposite angles are equal it comes from that property of angles, or that the angles in a triangle sum to 180. And I have these, as Will said, these connections together that mean that I can see how this uses that and uses that and brings them together. So for me, it's that sort of foundation and culmination. It plays this dual role, this foundation and culmination of those different types of knowledge: your declarative knowledge, your procedural knowledge, and your conditional knowledge. Conceptual understanding is what wraps around all of those. It enables you to develop those things, and it also develops from those things quite nicely.
Structure is an interesting one, because I've always found that I think we almost need like an additional term, because obviously we've got the contextual structures, like that Haylock would have described in his books, and then obviously you've got the mathematical structure more generally. Is it that relationship between the parameters that we get from definitions and how that sort of is realized in the mathematical world? Or is there a better way for teachers to interpret the word structure so that they can consider both contextual structure and structure as well in general?
I mean, so I guess when I talk about structure there, what I mean is, when I look at a problem in, let's say, compound measure, speed, distance, time, things like that, or unit conversion, and then I look at a problem set in a context of, I don't know, sharing in a ratio or a ratio type problem, then I don't see those as separate mathematical things. Yeah, that I'm aware of the fact that there's a multiplicative relationship that's going on in both of these contexts, and it doesn't really almost matter what the context is, which is for me when you get into proper mathematics, because the whole point of those abstract ideas, that comes from Will's definition, is that strip away all the context, strip away all the fluff that surrounds it, and fundamentally you've got the same mathematical idea underpinning. And so when I talk about structure and recognizing and exploiting structure, what I'm talking about there is the idea that, whether it comes up in this context or in this branch of maths, I did a session quite recently for the Future Teacher Scholars program around ratio tables, which obviously provide a window into one of those structures, that multiplicative structure. And somebody said to me, "Oh, my head of department tried to introduce ratio tables, but they only did it for ratio, so it kind of died." And I showed them how it could be used for, grading calculation, compound measure work, even trigonometry. And it's all actually part of the same underpinning mathematics idea. And so when I talk about structure in that context, I mean, kids being able to look at the underneath the context and see, well, actually, the mathematics at play here is this bit of mathematics that I'm already very familiar with.
I mean, why is conceptual understanding important?
So I think that sort of wraparound idea pretty much highlights its importance for me, because for me it's both the start and the end of the journey. I develop this deep knowledge, this connected knowledge in one idea that allows me to build and connect that new learning in a way that makes sense. And that, I think for me, that is my biggest tagline. Math should make sense. If what I'm doing now I can't make sense of, then I'm not really doing maths, because I'm just, manipulating abstract symbols or whatever else. Maths as a logically consistent subject has to make sense. And if I had one vision for maths education in this country, it would be, every new idea that's introduced to a learner should make sense to that learner. It should make sense from, they should be able to see how that follows from what they've studied before. And so, if I'm then building this new, we talked about there's three types of knowledge. If I'm now then building these new types of knowledge, this declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge, conditional knowledge, on that foundation in a way that makes sense for me based on my previous experience as a learner of mathematics, then that leads to new and greater understanding of the concept. So, if I give you an example, we talked about addition before. So take the addition of fractions. That's one that people that talk about developing procedural knowledge before conceptual knowledge will often use, get them good at doing it, and then they can see why later. But actually, the why that underpins that addition of fractions is much, much earlier. It's not even the case of you should study it afterwards. You should have studied it 2 or 3 years before, because the why that underpins that being, denominator tells us the fraction family. So am I talking about halves or thirds? And I know in primary schools they do a lot of great work with fraction families that tends to get lost at secondary. But, am I in the halves family or the thirds family or the quarters family? And addition, that being the sort of then the family, and then the numerator counts out where you are in that family, and then addition being needing that consistent family, that consistent unit, those, to borrow from algebra, those like terms. If I understand those two fundamental properties of fractions and of addition, then I already have the why for fraction addition. I don't need to be taught the why separately. I might need it highlighted to them, that actually this is the same as you were doing here. But I don't need to be taught that that's a why for adding fractions, because it's not a why for adding fractions, it's a why for adding anything. And that's where, that sort of conceptual knowledge, conceptual understanding at the start introduce those new when it's not a case of, we're now going to learn to add fractions. We're going to learn how addition applies, how the same ideas of addition apply to this. But if I don't understand those properties as a teacher, I'm basically then asking pupils to remember that this is the thing they have to do in a certain way, and some will remember it and others won't. And this is why we see those widening gaps as you go through, or one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, because we're working in the realm of memory, and some kids have got better memories than others, fundamentally. And that's why we get kids at 16 that still think you add fractions by adding the numerators and adding the denominators, because they've never really developed a concept either of what a fraction is in terms of a number or what addition is. But if I don't make, those things need making explicit all the way through the journey, not just after I've got good at a procedure.
That was a beautiful description of the place of fractions in a coherent curriculum. Stuart and I were talking about curriculum coherence last week's episode, and I don't think I've ever heard it described in such elegant terms. Do you think that, I'm expecting calculation with fractions, if we take this very specific example, to move in the primary national curriculum when the review happens?
Yes, me as well.
Do you think we'd benefit as teachers if we, in primary, had more time to focus on the denomination and the numeration and those fundamental parts before we went into that sort of calculating with them? Because it's fun to teach multiplication and addition with fractions, but even I would suggest that perhaps it could wait.
Yeah, no, I think it would. And I think, yes, if you've got more time to go into depth on those families and representation of fractions. But I think the other side, again, pulling on that last example, the other side is actually there's so much more given that time. And I wrote about this quite recently, actually, in one of my blogs, but that you could do with integer calculation, because integer calculation you can set those structures up right in integer calculation. One of the examples I've talked about is in the blog recently was, I think it was something like 4 times 8 plus 2 times 4. It wasn't that actually, because the answer ended up being 96, but I can't remember what it was now. But the goal there not being the answer, the goal being how many different ways can you arrive at the answer. And in fact, I think in the example I gave in my blog, that's why I remember the answer was 96, because the question was how many different ways can you show that this is 96? And even if you take something like 4 times 8 plus 2 times 4, then yes, you can do that as 32 plus 8. Or you can do it as 4 8s plus another 8. Or you can do it as 8 4s plus 2 4s. Or you can even start composing and decomposing, and recomposing and take it as 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. How many did I do there? 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, yes. 2 times 2 times 2 makes 2 plus 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. And you can factor it. And those structures that I'm talking about there, with the learning about addition, acting on like terms and units, multiplication, creating or changing units, and things like that, those structures you could explore in so much more depth with integers, that then when we come to do it with fractions, and this is the goal, I think, of the curriculum review, and particularly the Maths Horizon report, when they're talking about rebalancing. The goal there is that you spend that time getting really good at the structure, so that when I come to do it in secondary with fractions, it's easy, because it's like, well, you already know about all of this. I just need to tweak it to accommodate these numbers. It's something I used to say a lot about number line and vectors. So one of the big things I did in Visible Maths, and I'm very pleased to see that the Lumen curriculum took this on, and really went with it, was talking about using vectors on a number line rather than jumps. Because if you establish the properties of how vectors represent numbers at primary rather than jumps, 2D vectors at secondary, I can teach it in half an hour, because it's the same. It's exactly the same. It's just the arrows move in 2 dimensions now instead of 1. But it's the same. So you take the time to set up those structures and really get depth in everything that comes after. It literally child's play. It's so easy.
Lots of teachers. I mean, obviously, you were describing there sort of the 2 of the fundamental laws of arithmetic, sort of at play there. And I imagine, like in primary, lots of people will be worried even by the sound of associativity and distributivity. And what sort of approach did you take with your almost non-specialists in school to make sure they had the subject knowledge before they can consider their pedagogical approach to the teaching of these things?
So what within my department, I was running
Yeah,
a
I think so.
department.
Yeah, because I think there's almost there might be parallels there.
Yeah. So I mean, first things first, I did when I started, and we when I started my most recent head department role, which was 2014, which was at the school I've just left, although I was promoted to assistant principal in that time. Um, we did it slightly backwards because we're a key stage three only school, had to build a key stage four from scratch first because we were transferring from a 11 to 14 to 11 to 16 school. But then once that was in place and we were happy enough with it, wanted to come back and look at the key stage three. But as I've written about before, we spent must have been 18 to 30 months developing that. And when I say developing that, I mean every department meeting involving working with the sort of manipulatives that I wanted staff to work with, exploring what the key aspects were, exploring what the key structures were, and making sure the team was ready for that. And then looking at, so we were developing centralized sort of resources, but collectively across the team. So then people having the opportunity to bring what they developed to the meetings and talk about it and adapt it and discuss it and say what they think the key important bits were and stuff like that. And we spent somewhere between a year and a half and 2.5 years doing that before it even got near to pupils. We carried on what we were doing prior to that. And there is no substitute for it ultimately. You've got to give people the time and bring people along like anything else. Talk about it with learners, taking the time, rebalancing some stuff out of the key stage one, key stage two into key stage three, or general trend upwards, so that you've got more time. Well, adult learners still learn. You've got to meet them where they're at, and you've got to give them time to build strong foundations in that thing you want them to build on. Otherwise, they revert to type as soon as anything comes along that's remotely challenging or stressful.
And trying to make that default mode the very best it could possibly be. I mean, that I'm totally with you on the length of time it requires, and I think listeners will be too, because we know that Rome isn't built in a day, and certainly subject knowledge, but once you pass that tipping point, you can't remember a time when you didn't understand the mathematics, possibly a
Yeah.
threshold that you passed through.
I mean, one of the things I do with skip trainees, because I also train those as well, is I start with a very simple question. I've used it in other talks before. What is three? Because there was a time where that squiggle on a page, you wouldn't have been able to make sense of it. And you can't remember that time now. It's too far back and you've done so much more with it and built on from beyond then. But it is, it's one of those things that you do have to come back to and say, well, actually, this is where you've got to meet people at because this is where uh, where their understanding has stopped or has reached at this point. Just like you would with kids in a classroom, where are they at? What skills do they have? What do they already know? Is what they already know good stuff, or is it just surface level stuff? And then build from there. And a mutual colleague of ours, Mark McCourt, he's talked about 5 years to adapt a full career. I mean, I don't think we took quite that long, but I think there's still things to build in that curriculum and things to tweak and change. But when he gets people saying to him, "Oh, we're moving to mixed ability next year," and it's like, good luck with that. Yeah, but it takes years to develop that knowledge and awareness. And like you say, that changing that default mode until it's the best it can be. That's a really nice phrase actually, where you default to really good stuff.
I mean, how can we support pupils in developing conceptual understanding?
I mean, Will talked very well and very intelligently about some aspects of this. So he talked about the use of worked examples, which I think are crucial. You've got to, and I really liked the bit he talked about in terms of the sub goal idea. I think that's really really important when you're modeling, particularly when you're looking at a process or a procedure, and the procedural variation he talked about again, really really useful. So again, taking that adding fractions example, I immediately when he talked about sub goals, that's where my brain went to, because one of the steps in that process is arrive at the same denominator, and there's a sub goal that you can identify, highlight, and talk about. Why is this important? Why is this a useful thing? Tying that back to hopefully earlier knowledge that kids have built about how addition behaves in other scenarios. So a lot of that sort of stuff that he was talking about there really resonated with me. I was really, really on board with that. I think there are some further elements that we need to bring into that conversation. So again, earlier on we talked about angles on a point at a straight line summing to 180 degrees. So I can do lots of worked examples or study lots of worked examples about applying that property. But if I'm going to develop that deep connected knowledge, I also need to look at some non-examples. And I think that the interplay between example and non-example there is really, really important. I can see lots and lots and lots of situations where this works and I can apply it. But if I don't see situations where I can't, and in particular those crucial bits on the boundary, what's the weirdest scenario that you can still use this in? And what's the closest scenario to where I can't use it, but it looks like I can? If you don't see those non-examples and those boundary examples, that breadth and depth of understanding of the concept, I don't think is going to be there. So that conceptual variation to build up that full picture of the concept and its limits, I think is really, really important. What makes this something that I can apply, and when can I not? And this is where, if we don't do that, you get, and people have talked about this before, either over or under generalization. And that's, a key issue with lack of conceptual understanding from that conceptual variation. Kids, I still see it all the time. You have a diagram with two parallel lines and the transversal, and kids won't spot angle on a straight line at a point in that diagram because it's not part of what they've been exposed to when studying that thing. It's not brought up as a boundary example. I have a website, freya-models.co.uk, and in my 180 my straight angles on a point on a straight line Freya model, there are pictures in there with them on parallel lines. There are pictures on there with them in circle theorems, all sorts of places where kids are going to see this, and they need to see that it's an example of where it is. But on the other side of things, you get the undergeneralization, which is where kids don't apply a certain property when it can be applied. The one I use a lot, and it may be familiar with not, is index laws. So the standard sort of first index law is x to the power a times x to the power b equals x to the power of a plus b. Yeah. And kids don't apply that if you ask them to multiply 2x plus 3 all to the power 5 times 2x plus 3 all to the power 4. They think you've got to expand the brackets and all the rest of it because they don't see that base is the same. They undergeneralize. They don't see that is applicable in that sense because they've never seen it applied in that sense. They haven't seen that boundary example. They haven't had that conceptual variation. And so I think that sort of conceptual variation through those examples, non-examples, testing the limits of a concept, I think is a really important aspect of developing conceptual understanding. And then the other really big one for me, outside of what Will talked about, was the longitudinal view of coherence. That for me is about the sort of models and metaphors and representations that we're going to use that are going to reappear throughout the curriculum. If I want you, I talked earlier about the ratio tables, if I want you to see that this aspect of ratio is the same as this aspect of compound measure is the same as this aspect of gradient, well, then when I represent that and I talk about that, I need to be using the language. I need to be using a consistent representation. I need to be using the same notation so that you can see that, and as well as telling you, look, this is the same, look, this is the same again, but so that you can see it, so that you can see how it's the same structure, the same idea, that coherence working all the way through the curriculum. And this is one of the things that I really do hope comes out of the curriculum review and from what Maths Horizons have been saying, where they're going to put together this guidance that shows how these threads develop through these knowledge progression maps they're talking about. I really do hope they become a thing because, seeing how if you introduce it like this here, you can carry that through the entire curriculum will inform primary teachers as to why it's really important to do it like this here, will inform secondary teachers that this is where they've come from. It just creates that lovely journey which will naturally support that conceptual understanding.
That would be massive because it would reduce the amount of time you had to spend working out yourself or going on professional development to do so. If you had something you think, okay, here's this skeleton, and then I can add my thinking and my experience on top of this, that would be massive. I mean, what do you reckon that's likely to happen, or has it just been signaled that that should happen?
Well, I mean, say it depends on how much the curriculum review, when it comes to the math specific elements of it, relates to the Maths Horizons reports. There have been some definite calls for it in some of the debates in Parliament that I've seen recently, where they've explicitly mentioned, actually taking on board this as part of the curriculum review. So, touch wood, I'm quite hopeful of it, because if we get those sort of forward-facing bits going on and those journeys mapped out, what does building knowledge of addition, multiplicative structure, what do those look like as you go through? Then, yeah, that can be a real game changer.
Absolutely, I definitely think so. And certainly, I'm thinking back to my younger self. That was something I would have appreciated whenever I first started teaching. I mean, the idea of undergeneralization is really interesting. I think it doesn't really get spoken about very much. How might that manifest in sort of the primary classroom?
I mean, it's any scenario, and you obviously forgive me my lack of primary experience, but it's any scenario where, because of the lack of breadth of the examples they've seen, the non-examples they've seen, don't realise that something is a sort of example of what it is an example of. Again, the Future Teacher Scholar I was at recently, a brilliant one from Mark McCourt, who we've spoken about, where he examined triangleness. And the so you need to imagine here, but imagine a triangle where you've got a horizontal and then vertical coming down off that broadly at a right angle and then joined up to create a triangle. And one of the things he talked about there was kids will very often not recognize that as a triangle. They'll call it an upside down triangle because most of the triangles they've seen, the point goes up from the base. Yeah, that's what makes a triangle a triangle. That's part of what makes a triangle a triangle in their minds. And that's under generalization. So you ask them to work out the missing angles in that shape, they won't recognize it as a triangle. And because they won't recognize it as a triangle, they won't know which triangle properties to apply. And similarly with, very obtuse angled triangles, we tend not to see them a lot in textbooks, worksheets, etc. So if they don't form part of the example set that kids use to decide what a triangle is, then they won't see that they need to apply property triangles at that point. And as a sort of boundary example in the other direction, that you'll get some kids that will take an arrowhead kite and think it is a triangle, think the angle's in that sum to 180 degrees, stuff like that, because it looks kind of like a triangle, right? It's just got that extra little bit in there. And if you're talking about a triangle as, looking like the roof of your house or something like that, well, an arrowhead kite can look like the roof of your house. So that's still a thing, right? And so you get that would be be an example of overgeneralization, generalizing into something which it isn't. But all of the other types of triangles that we don't routinely expose kids to means that they don't see them as triangles. So that's an example in the one example in the primary context, but it is literally anything where, because we expose kids to limited amount of examples, and examples that have what you might term, I guess, non-essential properties. And this, you go into the variation theory literature. This is what and Watson, John Mason, people like it, talk about a lot. What are the essential and non-essential characteristics of this scenario? I don't think they use the word characteristics, but it's a good enough word as any. Varying the essential things while holding static the non-essential things, or varying the non-essentials while holding static the centrals, so that you can see what the impact of this change actually has. I've changed this, is this now still a triangle? Or I've changed this, does this now work in the same way, yes or no? And what under generalization is where, because they don't see enough of yes, it is, they don't recognize that it actually does apply in this case. Again, triangles is one example, but there'd be loads of them. Anything you exemplify that can appear in a lot of different ways.
Is it dimensions, the term they use? Is it
Dimensions of possible variation? Yes,
that's
I believe it is.
yeah,
And range of permitted change.
So I mean, do you think, because I always talk about misconceptions and overgeneralizations, the relationship there and the distinction between errors. Do you reckon you can add undergeneralization to the definition of misconceptions? Is it a misconception, or is it just not a fully formed concept yet?
I mean, I guess you could consider it a misconception from a point of view of a kid thinks this doesn't apply in this set, or a learner, I shouldn't say kid because adults make this mistake as well. But a learner thinks this doesn't apply in this case, and it does. And that's a misconception about that concept, in the same way as a kid thinks this applies in this case when it doesn't, is, a lack of complete understanding about the concept, either way round. So I guess you could call it a misconception from that point of view. But yeah, if a misconception is something that a kid simply doesn't understand about a concept, there's a gap in their knowledge about the concept, then arguably undergeneralization is more of it, because there really is a gap in that conception of what they see as part of that concept.
What's really clear from this conversation is that you've provided almost like a rationale, sort of almost like the fundamental principles, and then here's how we behave based on those principles. So I think anyone listening could think, okay, there are changes I can make to my practice, but if I'm a subject leader or I'm a school leader, I'm thinking, well, here's the way we're going to go about this from start to, to make this the way our department or our school behaves, and our approach to mathematics. If they want to find out more, are they going to conceptual maths to really get into it?
That's the bit. That's why I wrote it fundamentally, because it contains every, as far as I can tell, every part of school level maths that we would teach. Every concept. It provides the links between them. It provides representations and models that work all the way through the concept. Right from basic underpinnings all the way through to sort of advanced, top end GCSE stuff. I don't explore A level stuff because it's the school level maths, but so for example, in there's a journey which talks about, starting with modeling numbers using practical models, and in this case questionnaire rods, becoming the bar model, becoming the algebra tile that allows you to conceptualize what's going on with advanced algebra, and that coherence. And I would applaud any school that wants to sort of do that. It does, and I've spoken about this with people in the past. It does fundamentally require full curriculum change, because it needs to be thought through from right at the beginning to right to the end. What is that journey going to look like? And this is why I hope those knowledge progression maps do become a thing. But yes, that's why I wrote Conceptual Maths ultimately, was to give teachers that sort of guidance on, if we talk about this idea, here's where it starts, here's where it goes, all the way where it goes. Because I think it's important for everybody to know that. Yeah, if you're a primary teacher, you need to know why you should teach a bit of maths that you're working on in a certain way, using a certain model or certain metaphor, a certain representation, or a combination of those things, because actually it needs to be picked up by the secondary school in the same way. But if I do it if I do it in this way instead, well, then actually that's not laying the foundation that can sort of build on in secondary schools. This is why, from a primary perspective, the part whole model, the triangle model, it's always puzzled me that. Maybe you can shed some light on me for that, Kieran, but I can't see how that adds to my idea of addition. That's all. I can see it as a way of a testing addition, but I can't see it as a way of adding to my concept of addition, because it's a model that goes nowhere. It's never ever picked up again in secondary. In fact, it could easily be confused with factor trees for prime factors in secondary. I don't use those either, because again, and Gemma Sherwood writes brilliant on this, how they obscure the maths rather than highlight the maths. Rather than revealing structure, they actually obscure it. But yeah, it's something like a bar model has that longevity where it becomes these things for later on. And I think, that needs properly mapping out at a national level and then being given to schools along with the training, the support, everything else, so we can plan that coherent journey. But that is, what conceptual maths was designed to do. It was designed to support teachers in understanding that at both ends.
Crown House need to give me a code to DAPA so I can get commission. So, on the
If you're at MathConf, Kieran, I'll bring a copy for you.
that's very kind. When that's in June, isn't it?
June the 21st, yeah.
June 21st. Well, I've got Research at Kent this weekend, so maybe we'll see if I can get permission to leave, because there's only so many I'm allowed to do. On the part whole model, in my mind, I've always seen it as a precursor to the bar model. So in my classes, like whenever I was in school, Key Stage 1 would have utilized it as a representation of partitioning, and then, but also as a description of knowns and unknowns, because the bar model for me is based around what we know, what we don't know, and how that feeds into the structure. Where I think you find difficulty is transient information, because we will often have part whole models with 5 here and then 3 and 2 in each of the arms and that kind of thing. So that's where I'm thinking. But I know it's a really, really prevalent model in a lot of English based
Yeah,
curricula, isn't it?
it is, and that's it. And I've not really understood why or where it came from, because I was having this discussion with mine. So at Twinkle, I'm the secondary maths education lead. I have a primary maths education lead who works there as well, John Critwell. And I was having this discussion with the other day. I can't see how you couldn't use something like a tens frame or a bar model or something similar to do that same thing and to represent that same idea in a way that is actually going to have longevity. And if I've got time at some point in the future, I'll do a research project about where it first arose, because I'd love to know where that first. I suspect it was just like many things. Some person wrote it in a textbook thinking this will be useful to show how these things combine, but it's not one that ever, where else do you ever see that as a model for addition ever again? You don't. It provides that, and that's not necessarily to say that early conceptualizations are not a bad thing, but we've got to be careful with them. Take away as a prime example, it's a great early model for subtraction, regardless of what some people will say, because it speaks to kids' lived experience. Yeah, I had this many, and this lot got removed, and now what's left? We know from the literature and from the research that if kids get stuck on a takeaway model of subtraction, that's a bad thing for them going forwards. Difference model, additive inverse model, better models for going forwards. So takeaway has its place, but it's not something it is something that's going to appear all the way through the curriculum. And I think that's where it's slightly different, because you're always going to face scenarios where you've had started with a pot, started with a total, and had something removed. But it's not a model we're going to use. You don't subtract surds using a takeaway model. It just doesn't work. But yeah, that particular representation, I mean, part whole as a concept makes perfect sense, but that particular representation of it, I can't see why it's become so prevalent. But I mean, that doesn't say much about conceptual understanding or whatever else, except to say if we're thinking about coherence and are thinking about that journey for kids to go on, where does that representation fit into that journey?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Fewer carefully chosen representations, and you're onto a winner. I reckon if you do that research, I'd be really interested to see where you end up. I reckon Shanghai because it's big in the NCETM materials, isn't it? So perhaps there's a Shanghai textbook, and I'm trying to think if I could find digital copies on.
Maybe, maybe. I don't know if it originated with NCETM though, or whether NCETM just picked it up because it was already being used. I know it's big in White Rose, but that might be because it's big in other places as well. This is the thing. Need to do some digging. Don't really have the time now. Have a
Yeah.
master's dissertation to finish, and a fourth book to write. So,
Well, from my perspective, I don't
um,
remember it featuring in the old sort of national strategies and stuff. So it's a 2012 onwards kind of situation, but I'd be very interested to find out. So I mean, Pete could have chatted with you for like 4 or 5 hours here. There were questions I stopped myself from asking. It's like, right, okay, well, we can chat about that later on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
yeah, no, I've loved it. Thanks, Kieran. I really appreciate you having me on and taking the time. So I love talking about all things maths and yeah, and particularly about developing good, strong mathematical underpinnings for learners. So yeah, no, really, really enjoyed coming on. Thank you very much for
So,
having me.
no, me too. It's taken me far too long to get around to this, but hopefully this will be the first of many. All that to do is said, everyone at home. Until next time, thanks for listening.